Falcha, welcome back. This is part 2 of The Dawn of Everything. Oh, and I didn't tell you how many pages. I won't even count the notes and all the stuff at the back. "526 pages. A little light reading. So, we were going to talk about New France. So, in the area of which we speak around the Great Lakes, there were a number of different tribes of Native Americans. And the inhabitants spoke a language, the French, called the Montagnais, which included Naskapi, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing everything, so, equal time. Naskapi, Algonquin, and Iroquois. Near the coasts, they were fishers and foresters and hunters, and they did some horticulture. The Wendat, which we call the Huron, were inland, and they were living in major river valleys. They grew maize and squash and beans, and they had fortified towns. So there was a real variety of styles of living. The French ignored these distinctions because they considered growing a garden as woman's work, so they just didn't even count that as a defining characteristic of their culture. The men were hunters and went to war, so therefore they were the natural aristocrats. This is all the French interpretation. And therefore they were noble savages. So that's where the expression noble savage comes from. Not that they had this sort of characteristic of integrity or something. Noble in the sense of they were aristocrats. And they engaged in the business of nobility. In 1608, Father Pierre Biard was a Jesuit, a theology professor, and he was sent to evangelize the Micmac of Nova Scotia, who spoke Algonquin. They had already lived for a while near a French fort, so they weren't completely untainted by European civilization. They considered themselves already at that point, as they put it, better than the French. I'll read you why. This gets really good. For they say, these are the natives talking to the French. You're always fighting and quarreling among yourselves. We live peaceably. You're envious and are all the time slandering each other. You are thieves and deceivers. You are covetous and are neither generous nor kind. As for us, if we have a morsel of bread, we share it with our neighbor. They are saying these and like things continually, according to the Father. What seemed to irritate Biard the most was that the Micmac would constantly assert that they were, as a result, richer than the French. The French had more material possessions, the Micmac conceded, but they had other greater assets. The Micmac had other greater assets: ease, comfort, and time. In 1628, a brother George Gabriel Sagard, a Recollect friar, a Recollect is the name and brand of the order that he belonged to, was sent to the Huron by his order. And he was at first highly critical of Wendat life, which he described as inherently sinful. He was obsessed with the idea that Wendat women were all intent on seducing him. But by the end of his sojourn, he had come to the conclusion that their social arrangements were in many ways superior to those at home in France. In the following passages, he was clearly echoing Wendat opinion. Quote, "They have no lawsuits and take little pains to acquire the goods of this life, for which we Christians torment ourselves so much. And for our excessive and insatiable greed in acquiring them, we are justly and with reason reproved by their quiet life and tranquil dispositions." Much like Father Baird, his Micmac encounters, the Wendat were particularly offended by the French lack of generosity to one another. They reciprocate hospitality and give such assistance to one another that the necessities of all are provided for without there being any indigent beggar in their towns and villages. And they considered it a very bad thing when they heard it said that there were in France a great many of these needy beggars, and thought that this was for lack of charity in us, and blamed us for it severely. Wendock cast a similarly jaundiced eye at French habits of conversation. Sagard was surprised and impressed by his host's eloquence and powers of reasoned argument, skills honed by near-daily public discussions of communal affairs. His hosts, in contrast, when they did get to see a group of Frenchmen gathered together, often remarked on the way they seemed to be constantly scrambling over each other and cutting each other off in conversation, employing weak arguments, and overall, or so the subtext seemed to be, not showing themselves to be particularly bright. People who tried to grab the stage, denying others the means to present their arguments, and acting in much the same way as those who grabbed the material means of subsistence and refused to share it. It's hard to avoid the impression that Americans saw the French as existing in a state of Hobbesian state, of war of all against one. So these guys, these priests and explorers, they had really not a whole lot of contact yet with French women or French children. I'm sorry, the natives had very little encounter with French women and French children, because the French that came over were mostly explorers and traders and priests. And so, you know, you have to sort of take it with a block of salt, because you're talking about really rough people, you know, kind of survivalist types who wanted to go kill small furry animals for a living in a strange place. They were extremely competitive with each other because of the trade thing, and there was a lack of mutual care amongst the men. Sagard's book was a huge bestseller, this priest, and it was read by Voltaire. It was read by Locke. There was a series of books, 71 volumes, called The Jesuit Relations, that were the missionary field reports from New France. Absolutely fascinating. They only mentioned equality in terms of gender relationships, and they were totally scandalized by gender relationships amongst the natives. All the natives remarked on the competitiveness and selfishness of the hostility to freedom of the French. Indigenous Americans were more like us than Europeans on that time were like us now, on issues of personal freedom, gender equality, sexual mores, and sovereignty. When I say us, I mean modern liberal Americans. 17th century Jesuits did not believe in personal freedom. They did not think that it was a good thing. They thought it was animalistic. And Father Lalemant, no, this is Father Lejeune, said, they imagine that they ought, by right of birth, to enjoy the liberty of wild ass colts, rendering no homage to anyone whomsoever except when they like. This is the natives. They have reproached me 100 times because we fear our captains, while they laugh at and make sport of their own. All the authority of the chief is in his tongue's end, for he is powerful insofar as he is eloquent. And even if he kills himself talking and haranguing, he will not be obeyed unless he pleases the savages. And then we've got the natives making fun of the French because they were no better than slaves, because they were afraid of their superiors. I do not believe that there is any people on earth freer than they, and less able to allow the subjugation of their wills to any power whatever. So much so that fathers have no control over their children, or captains over their subjects, or the laws of the country over any of them, except insofar as each is pleased to submit to them. There is no punishment which is inflicted on the guilty, and no criminal who is not sure that his life and property are in no danger. The Jesuits said that this created a much less disorderly situation than there is in France, but they were opposed to freedom, that Christians answer only to God. So let's see here what they had to say about that. This is really interesting. Rather than punishing culprits, the Wendat insisted that the culprit's entire lineage or clan pay compensation. This made a wrongdoing everyone's responsibility, and it was their responsibility to keep their kindred under control. It is not the guilty who suffer the penalty, the priest said, but rather the public that must make amends for the offenses of the individuals. If a Huron had killed an Algonquin or another Huron, the whole country assembled, that means all of the people of the tribe, to agree the number of gifts due to the grieving relatives to stay the vengeance of what they might take. This form of justice restrains all these peoples and seems more effectively to repress disorders than the personal punishment of criminals does in France, despite being a very mild proceeding, which leaves individuals in such a spirit of liberty that they never submit to any laws and obey no other impulse than that of their own will. There are a number of things worth noting here. One is that it makes clear that some people were indeed considered wealthy when that society was not economically egalitarian in that sense. However, there was a difference between what we would consider economic resources like land, which was owned by families, worked by women, and whose products were largely disposed of by women's collectives, and the kind of wealth being referred to as the wealth the men considered wealth, which was wampum, which we talked about in our other book, a word applied to strings and belts of beads manufactured from the shells of Long Island's quahog clam, or other treasures which largely existed for political purposes. So the value of it was not monetary, the value was the political symbolism of it. Worldly Wendat man hoarded such precious things, largely to be able to give them away on dramatic occasions. Neither in the case of land and agricultural products, nor that of wampum and similar valuables, was there any way to transform access to material resources into power. Didn't give them power. At least not the kind of power that might allow one to make others work for you or compel them to do anything they did not wish to do. At best, the accumulation and adroit distribution of riches might make a man more likely to aspire to political office, to become a chief or a captain. The French sources tend to use these words indiscriminately. But as the Jesuits all continually emphasized, merely holding political office did not give anyone the right to give orders to anyone else. Or, to be completely accurate, an office holder could give all the orders that he or she liked, but no one was under any particular obligation to follow them. They were appalled by the sexual politics. Native women had full control over their own bodies. Unmarried women had sexual liberty. Married women could divorce at will. The Jesuits freaked out. The wicked liberty of the savages. They did not submit to the yoke of God's law. They even had trouble translating to the Native Americans the concepts of Lord, commander, obedience. They weren't concepts that existed for them. How the Europeans heard from Native Americans about the connection between reasoned debate, personal freedom, and the refusal of arbitrary power really had to do with the French and the Native Americans arguing with each other about what constituted those things. In 1648, near Quebec, in a Christian Wendat village, now isn't that interesting, a Christian Wendat village, an illegal shipment of alcohol got to the village and caused trouble. So the white governor, got the Wendat to okay a prohibition with a threat of punishment. And this was a whole new concept. From the beginning of the world to the coming of the French, the savages had never known what it was so solemnly to forbid anything to their people under any penalty, however slight. They are free people, each of whom considers himself of as much consequence as the other, and they submit to their chiefs only insofar as it pleases them. It's also the whole Eurasian notion of equality before the law, which is ultimately equality before the sovereign. That is, once again, equality in common subjugation. One guy in charge, everybody else doing what he says. Americans, by contrast, were equal insofar as they were equally free to obey or disobey orders as they saw fit. The democratic governance of the Wendat and Five Nations of the Haudenosaunee, which so impressed later European readers, was an expression of the same principle. If no compulsion was allowed, then obviously such social coherence as did exist had to be created through reasoned debate, persuasive arguments, and the establishment of social consensus. The Enlightenment marked the beginning of Europeans having open, rational debate, because that just didn't happen before. The Wendat had a facility in logical argumentation. The Jesuits were always, still are, considered the big intellectuals of the Catholic Church, and they were trained in classical rhetoric and classical disputation. And they had also learned the native languages so that they'd be able to persuade them to Christianity in their own tongue. And they were really, really surprised, regularly surprised by the quality of the natives' ability to debate and argue. And they also remarked on natives' openness in conducting public affairs. There wasn't all this secret politicking. How and when they knew nothing of the Romans and the Greeks. That's what I wrote. I'm not sure that's really even a sensible question, but let's just see what I was trying to get at in a very poor way. So, according to this Jesuit, there are almost none of them, natives, incapable of conversing or reasoning very well and in good terms on matters within their knowledge. The councils held almost every day in the villages and on almost all matters improve their capacity for talking. Or, in the priest's words, I can say in truth that as regards intelligence, they are in no wise inferior to Europeans and to those who dwell in France. I would never have believed that, without instruction, nature could have supplied a most ready and vigorous eloquence, which I have admired in many Hurons, or more clear-sightedness in public affairs, or more discreet management in things to which they are accustomed. Some Jesuits went farther, remarking, not without a trace of frustration, that the New World savages seemed rather cleverer overall than the people that they were used to dealing with at home. For example, they nearly all show more intelligence in their business, speeches, courtesies, intercourses, tricks, and subtleties than do the shrewdest citizens and merchants in France. Still, persuasiveness need not to take the form of logical argumentation. It can just as easily involve appeal to sentiment, whipping up passions, deploying poetic metaphors, appealing to myth or proverbial wisdom, employing irony and indirection, humor, insult, or appeals to prophecy or revelation. And the degree to which one privileges any of these has everything to do with the rhetorical tradition to which the speaker belongs and the presumed disposition of his audience. And I would insert my own opinion there that we're talking about a culture with an oral tradition. One of the reasons why in Ireland language is revered and the ability to tell a good story is honored, because it was an oral tradition. People passed everything down by word of mouth, and practice makes perfect, right? So native leaders with no power to force people to do anything had remarkable rhetorical skill. There was a refusal in their culture of arbitrary power. They were open and inclusive in political debate. They honored reasoned argument. And indigenous language was better for reasoned debate. They considered it entertainment, intellectual games. This was all picked up by Enlightenment thinkers in Europe and connected with a rejection of arbitrary authority, and especially the arbitrary authority of clergy. In the middle of the 17th century, most discussions about liberty and those concepts were not really about equality. They still didn't buy it that people were equal. There was some semi-communism going on in the northeastern woodlands tribes. Women owned and worked the fields together and shared the products collectively. Men owned the tools and weapons and shared the game collectively. They lived like the original sense of the word communism, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. During this time in American societies, it would have been inconceivable to reject a request for food. People were not allowed to go hungry. The French did not see an obligation to share food or shelter. This absolutely scandalized the Native Americans. They write about it all the time. Europeans were always squabbling for advantage over each other. The natives guaranteed each other the means to an autonomous life. No one was subordinate. Communism supported individual freedom. And all around the Great Lakes, the societies assured that no one would be subjugated to the will of any one other person. So this extended to all of these different tribal groups. There was a guy called Kandiaronk who was a Wendat, and he was considered a philosopher. His ideas on human nature and society directly affected the Enlightenment. Now, the reason he's their great man is because he had long conversations with the French, who wrote everything down that he talked about. That doesn't mean that his opinion was more valued than anybody else. He just happened to be the one that got the focus. A poor French aristocrat, so well-born but poor, Louis Armand de Lamarck, the Baron de Lahontan, who became known as Lahontan, was a 17-year-old. He joined the French army because he was broke, and he was sent to Canada. And for 10 years, he was the deputy to the Governor General, Comte de Frontenac. He became fluent in Algonquin and Wendat. He made friends with the indigenous political figures. He was a religious skeptic, and he was an enemy of the Jesuits. He didn't like the Jesuits. And therefore, the natives were willing to share with him their true opinions of Christianity. Very interesting. So Kandiaronk, the philosopher, his name means muskrat, the rat, was the key strategist of a group called the Wendat Confederacy, which was a coalition of 4 Iroquois-speaking peoples. And these 4 were trying very hard to avert an assault by, here's that word again, the Haudenosaunee, which were 5 nations together. And they were trying very cleverly, these Iroquois-speaking people, to play them off the French and the English and, a complex geopolitical game to avert assault. The long-term goal was to form a comprehensive indigenous alliance against the advance of the settlers. They were courageous warriors, not they, the rat, what's his name? Kandiaronk. I'm just going to call him the muskrat because I can't ever pronounce his name. He was considered a courageous warrior, and a brilliant orator, a skillful politician, and a staunch opponent of Christianity. Lahontan, this young French aristocrat, ran afoul of the French government, and he was forced to flee the French territory. And he was in exile for insubordination. And he was ending up in Europe, but he could not live in France. He had to live outside France. In 1702, he was living in Amsterdam, and he was a penniless vagrant and a freelance spy. But he wrote a book about his time in the New World and what it was like. And he wrote a series of books, 2 memoirs, and the third book was a set of 4 conversations with the muskrat. And this book was extremely critical of European mores and ideas about religion, politics, health, and sex. It was the true Native American view of the white settlers. He became a minor celebrity, this French guy. He moved to Hanover, and he was close with Leibniz, the guy who said his belief system or his writings were strongly influenced by Native American thought. And this French guy died in 1715, Lahontan. And the criticism was, oh, well, he said this was all the idea of the natives, but it was really his own ideas. It wasn't the natives. But the book a discussion of deism, monastic politics, and legal affairs. And it did sound very European. But it sounded European because the whole thing was set up to argue, to criticize the church, and for Lahontan to lose the argument. So he was trying to make his point about the natives' critical view without saying he agreed with them. Because if he said he agreed with them, he'd get in trouble with the church. So it was a delicate balance. The French concluded that, well, of course, this is the French guy's ideas, but it was really, truthfully, Muskrat's idea. Later, it was understood that the native was known to be the original guy and had argued these issues just the very way that the French guy said. Interestingly enough, at the time, he went to France, the Muskrat did, and was at Wendat ambassador to the court of Louis XIV in 1691. I would love to have been a fly on that wall. Can you imagine a Huron native in the court of Louis XIV? Wow. Anyway, he'd been engaged in political negotiations with Europeans for years. He was well aware of European points of view. His arguments shared and documented the beliefs of other people back in America. The authors said that he had kept notes when he was talking with the Muskrat and that these were his true beliefs. So Europeans didn't want to believe that any of this was coming from, savages. The Native Americans who had been in France were continually teasing us with the faults and disorders they observed in our towns as being occasioned by money. There's no point in trying to remonstrate with them about how useful the distinction of property is for the support of society. They make a joke of anything you say on that account. In short, they neither quarrel nor fight nor slander one another. They scoff at arts and sciences and laugh at the difference of ranks which is observed with us. They brand us for slaves and call us miserable souls whose life is not worth having, alleging that we degrade ourselves in subjugating ourselves to one man, the king, who possesses all the power and is bound by no law but his own will. They were critical of the squabbling, of the lack of mutual aid, of the blind submission to authority, and the use of private property. They think it unaccountable that one man should have more than another, and that the rich should have more respect than the poor. In short, they say the name of savages which we bestow upon them would fit ourselves better, since there is nothing in our actions that bears an appearance of wisdom. Native Americans, who had the opportunity to observe French society from up close, had come to realize one key difference from their own, one which may not otherwise have been apparent. Whereas in their own societies there was no obvious way to convert wealth into power over others, with the consequence that differences of wealth had little effect on individual freedom. In France, the situation could not have been more different. Power over possessions could be directly translated into power over other human beings. And about that, as well as casting doubt on the historicity of Scripture, the Muskrat continually emphasizes the fact that Christians are divided into endless sects, each convinced they're entirely right, and all the others are hellbound. To give a sense of his argument, this is a quote from Kandiaronk. Come on, my brothers, don't get up in arms, he says this to the French. It's only natural for Christians to have faith in their holy scriptures, since from their infancy they've heard so much of them. Still, it is nothing if not reasonable for those born without such prejudice, such as the Wendots, to examine matters more closely. However, having thought long and hard over the course of a decade about what the Jesuits have told us of the life and death of the Son of the Great Spirit, any Wendot could give you 20 reasons against the notion. For myself, I've always held that if it were possible that God had lowered his standards sufficiently to come down to earth, he would have done it in full view of everyone, descending in triumph with pomp and majesty and most publicly. He would have gone from nation to nation, performing mighty miracles, thus giving everyone the same laws. Then we would all have had exactly the same religion, uniformly spread and equally known throughout the four corners of the world, proving to our descendants from then till 10,000 years into the future the truth of this religion. Instead, there are 500 or 600 religions, each distinct from the other, of which, according to you, the religion of the French alone is any good, sainted, or true. Touché. On law, he said the European punitive law, like eternal damnation, is not necessitated by any inherent corruption of human nature, but rather by a form of social organization that encourages selfishness and acquisitive behavior. Oh, another quote. I hope you guys don't mind me reading these quotes. They're so long, but they're so funny, I think. So the French guy, Lahontan, said, this is why the wicked need to be punished and the good need to be rewarded. Otherwise, murder, robbery, and defamation would spread everywhere. And in a word, we would become the most miserable people on the face of the earth. And Kandiaronk says, for my own part, I find it hard to see how you would be much more miserable than you already are. What kind of human, what species of creature must Europeans be that they have to be forced to do good and only refrain from evil because of fear of punishment? You have observed that we lack judges. What is the reason for that? Well, we never bring lawsuits against one another. And why do we never bring lawsuits? Well, because we made a decision neither to accept or make the use of money. And why do we refuse to allow money into our communities? The reason is this: we are determined not to have laws, because since the world was a world, our ancestors have been able to live contentedly without them. And let's see here. He says, I have spent 6 years reflecting on the state of European society, and I still can't think of a single way they act that's not inhuman. And I genuinely think this can only be the case as long as you stick to your distinctions of mine and thine. I affirm that what you call money is the devil of devils, the tyrant of the French, the source of all evils, the bane of souls and slaughterhouse of the living. To imagine one can live in the country of money and preserve one's soul is like imagining one could preserve one's life at the bottom of a lake. Money is the father of luxury, lasciviousness, intrigues, trickery, lies, betrayal, insincerity, of all the world's worst behavior. Fathers sell their children, husbands their wives. Wives betray their husbands. Brothers kill each other. Friends are false, and all because of money. In the light of all this, tell me what we Wendot are not right in refusing to touch, or so much as to look at silver. Try for once to actually listen. Can't you see, my friend, that the nations of Europe could not survive without gold and silver or some similar precious symbol? Without it, nobles, priests, merchants, and any number of others who lack the strength to work the soil would simply die of hunger. Our kings would not be kings. What soldiers would we have? Who would work for kings or anybody else? It would plunge Europe into chaos and create the most dismal confusion imaginable. The French guy, now the native. You honestly think you're going to sway me by appealing to the needs of nobles, merchants, and priests? If you abandoned conceptions of mine and thine, Yes, such distinctions between men would dissolve. A leveling equality would then take its place among you as it now does among the Wendat. And yes, for the first 30 years after the banishing of self-interest, no doubt you would indeed see a certain desolation, as those who are only qualified to eat, drink, sleep, and take pleasure would languish and die, but their progeny would be fit for our way of living. Over and over I have set forth the qualities that we Wendat believe ought to be defining humanity: wisdom, reason, equity, etc., and demonstrated that the existence of separate material interests knocks all these on the head. A man motivated by interest cannot be a man of reason. So it was easy to dismiss him because he would exaggerate in hyperbole, and they did have laws, and they did have quarrels, and they did have inequalities in wealth. So he did romanticize his society, but it was an exaggeration of the truth, but it was the truth, and he did it as a rhetorical device to make a point. In 1930, the anthropologist Greg Bateson developed the theory of schismogenesis, which is a people's tendency to define themselves against the characteristics of another group. So they do this, we don't do that, we do the opposite. You find the other so disagreeable and so different and so distasteful, and then you try to be as little like them as possible. You go out of your way to prove your differences. That's kind of what he was doing. You exaggerate minor differences. People and societies do this. National character, urbanity, barbarous acts, they're always described in really extreme terms. So as Europeans meet the Americas, you see that both cultures learn from each other and adopt things from each other, but then they also hugely exaggerate differences that they don't like. And the muskrat argues against money, and even today, indigenous cultures complain of white men living in the way of money, like the path of money. So all these books with these debates and conversations became very popular. They even made plays based on the same themes, and they became very popular. European thinkers' critique of European society was really just a parroting of what they heard the Native Americans say. In 1747, there was a book called The Letters of a Peruvian Woman. It was really a landmark feminist book, one of the earliest. It was about a captive Inca princess who argues against European culture and patriarchy and the idea of state socialism, and the French king who she believed in redistributing all of the wealth and argued that, and like take the wealth of the king and redistribute it and be like the Inca. And this inspired a guy called Turgot and his idea of material economic progress. And this is sort of a way in which an argument about freedom became an argument about equality due to the indigenous critique of European culture. The book Letters of an Inca Princess depicted the Inca Empire as benevolent, and it was a despotism, but it was a benevolent despotism. They criticized the French lack of individual freedom and violent inequalities in France. Turgot said that this was coming from a primitive society where everyone was equal, but they were equally poor. And as society got more complex and richer and technology grew, the difference between people is created partly because of a complex division of labor. So craftspeople and miners, or teachers versus laborers, that the job itself actually makes the distinction. That the prosperity of a society is almost on the whole necessarily creates the poverty of some, so that if anyone is going to be prosperous, somebody has to be poor. That seems like a backward argument. There's no avoiding inequality. Enforced equality, a uniformity of social conditions, would crush initiative, and social and economic catastrophe would ensue. A lot of capitalists like to argue that about socialism, that if everybody were equal and everybody had things handed to them, it would destroy competitive advances, that people would become lazy, like, let's not give them an extra $1,400 or they'll never go back to work. That sort of mindset. The primacy of technological progress as a driver of social improvement became the theory of economic development, that hunters evolved into pastoralists, with instead of hunting wild animals, they domesticated to an extent, things like sheep and cows, and then farming, and that degenerated into urban life and commercial life and industry. The first in the series become the vestiges of a more primitive past. So farmers looked down on hunter-gatherers, urban dwellers look down on farmers, and we kind of still have that. People tend to look at people living in rural areas as hicks. So this particular theory became the prevailing paradigm, and egalitarian societies were considered primitive, the bottom of the ladder of social development, and really not doable in modern urban complexity. Indigenous Americas saw individual autonomy and freedom of action as the consummate values. Society was organized to minimize anyone being subordinated to the will of another. And when we talk about society, we're not talking about a wandering band of 20 people. We're talking about settlements of thousands and thousands of people. The French, especially the Jesuits, condemned all this freedom because the church doesn't want anyone to be free. Some saw it as a provocative and appealing idea, some not the church. The Enlightenment ideas came from these indigenous societies, and they were a huge threat to the church. So Rousseau said that freedom and equality were the universals and were inconsistent with a regime based on private property. So did arts and sciences lead to a better understanding of the world? That was this question on the second essay that Rousseau did. And he said, no, society corrupts. That's where the notion of innocence devolved into corruption as society became more complex came from. This was the essay that won. The essay he wrote on the origins of social inequality got disqualified for being too long, but he won the second essay contest. Humans in a state of nature tend to be solitary, and society was a restraint on human freedom because it's people who aren't solitary. That the fall from grace, Garden of Eden, was caused by a moral decline, and this imaginary state of nature, the state of Stone Age savagery, changed as language came into being used, and an increase in civilization as they went from wandering around to agriculture and metallurgy and crafts and industry. And as people claimed land to farm, the idea of personal property was born. But the fruits of the farms belong to everyone, and the earth itself belongs to no one, is how the natives were living. So how do the Europeans turn personal wealth into power? How does an unequal distribution of material goods turn into the ability to tell other people what to do, to have servants, to let people die of starvation? How does that happen? The Europeans were neither generous nor kind, and they didn't seem to care about each other. And so his essay was weird because it was a combination of indigenous critique of Europeans reference to the biblical fall from the Garden to Eden, and this new theory of material development, that property, personal property, came from owning land. Rousseau agreed with natives that Europeans were atrocious, that property was the problem, but he can't even imagine another alternative, a solution to that. Natives believed that people could share and respond to each other's needs and not get one up on each other. And without food and shelter and the basics, nobody is free. And the Europeans had these ideas that came down from the Roman concept of the paterfamilias, that the father is in charge of the family and had the power of life and death over the entire family, and also had the freedom of owning everything. And so that sense of the father in charge, the father owns everything, he has all the control. They think that that's probably maybe where the notion came that wealth and ownership gave you power. And the freedom that happened from that was exercised at the cost of other people. The old Roman laws were geared towards the self-sufficiency of a household. So they kind of encouraged that not caring for other people, that each household was a little kingdom of its own, run by the father, and needing to be self-sufficient, needing to supply its own stuff. And it kind of implied a disregard for other people. That freedom was not needing to depend on other people, and that private land kind of chained you, kind of tied you down. Rousseau was arguing that freedom and liberty was often blamed as what caused the French Revolution. His arguing that freedom and liberty were a good thing put notions in people's heads. There is a thing called the Manifesto of the Secret Order of the Illuminati. This is a real thing. This is not just theory. This is a real thing. So, this is from the Manifesto. As families multiplied, the means of subsistence began to fail. The nomad life ceased and property started into existence. Men chose habitations. Agriculture made them intermix. Language became universal. Living together, one man began to measure his strength with another, and the weaker was distinguished from the stronger. This undoubtedly created the idea of mutual defense, of one individual governing diverse families reunited, and of thus defending their persons and their fields against the invasion of an enemy. But hence, liberty was ruined in its foundation, and equality disappeared. Okay, the book is not saying this is what you should believe. This is an idea that was expressed in the Manifesto of the Secret Order of the Illuminati. Now, this was a network of revolutionary cadres that were organized within the Freemasons by the Bavarian law professor Adam Weishaupt. So, for every theory, there's always a kernel of truth. There were people formed by the Freemasons who called themselves the Illuminati. There's writing all about it. And they wanted to educate the elite to work for freedom and equality. But they were denounced by the conservatives in the government, and they were banned in 1785. And right-wing conspiracists at the time said that it continued. And even today, they believe that it still continues, and that their secret organization and beliefs were what drove the French Revolution. This is not true. But Rousseau started out with this conservative idea that progress leads to decay, and eventually he was accused, which is funny because he started out with this conservative idea, but eventually was accused of starting a political left movement of the revolution. So at his time, the concept of right and left, liberal, conservative, didn't really exist. What it really refers to is where the seats were of the aristocracy and the popular factions of the French National Assembly in 1789. So when the National Assembly met in 1789, the aristocrats sat on the right, the common folks sat on the left. That's where the notion of political right and left come from. So there never was a true noble savage of savage innocence. It was all about the fact that these guys were big shot hunters and warriors. They must be the nobles. There was no such thing as happy primordial innocence. The Europe of the time, the European of the time who interacted with the natives, said that the native societies were far more complicated than they would ever have guessed. The idea of noble savage innocence was actually created in 1859 by racists, there's a shock, in the British Ethnological Society, who called for the extermination of inferior people, so they had to make them inferior. The Jesuits were accused of talking about the noble savages to undermine the monarchy and the religion, and the missionaries and blame them for the revolutionary spirit. And this is all elucidated in a book from 1913 by a guy called Chouinard. He said that indigenous people were too different of a race to be a meaningful group, that they might as well record the political opinions of a leprechaun. I beg your pardon. What only matters is what the white people think. This is what they believed. So what if these this is what modern historical belief has been founded on. And this is what they're teaching in schools. This is what the books all talk about. And modern historians, not all of them, but mainstream, would defend most of this. What if these indigenous people were free of rulers because they were better able to imagine such a society? And they arranged their society to avoid arbitrary power and domination. Rousseau proposed, and 19th century imperialists embraced, the idea of the stupid savage, that these natives were living in a state of blissful ignorance. But what does equality really mean? Does it mean that we're all the same as each other, that we should all have the same access to everything, that we should all be treated the same, that we all get the same amount of stuff? What does this mean for individuality if we're all the same? Then is nobody allowed to be different? What about respect for elders? What about gender? So some egalitarian societies are equal for men only. And what if certain work that you do gives you a higher status? What if we're all powerless in the eyes of God? So all these questions need to be looked at. We need to look at the past with a different set of eyes and with a whole different set of assumptions. So as you can see, this book sort of moves forward and then refers again to the past, and then moves forward again and then goes back to the past. And to summarize very briefly, because this is a really good place to stop this particular video, what they're arguing is that contemporary mainstream anthropological, sociological, archaeological, historical, and to some extent philosophical belief is entrenched in these old debates. And those old debates minimized and dismissed what was really going on in the past. And as we're going to eventually discover, nothing was as clear as the hierarchical, first there were foragers and later there was urban industrialization in a nice stepping stone of progress through time. First there were innocent, stupid, primordial people, and now there are great thinkers. That's not at all what the legacy of human presence on Earth indicates. And we have, to some extent, chosen to ignore the little evidence that we do have. We've dismissed a lot of it from racial and religious prejudice. And these guys say, okay, it's time to stop where we are now and go back and reevaluate what we do know and leave the door open for evidence that has yet to be revealed, because there's so much archaeology sitting waiting to be dug up, basically. But not to dismiss things as the rantings and ravings of the deluded, that this is all legitimate debate that went on in the past. I think it's fascinating, and I think the concept of these different sorts of cultures is so interesting. Gives you hope that there is the potential to live a different way. So I'm going to stop here because it's a really good place in the book to stop, and I will be back with part 3 soon. And I'm pacing myself because this is a really long book, and I don't want to do 12 hours today. That's crazy. And I haven't gotten far enough of the book. I'm about halfway through the book. So I haven't gotten far enough to do the whole thing in one weekend. So we'll see. We'll see how far we go today. I might only do 1 or 2 more videos and then return to it next week. Maybe divide it over 3 weeks. I don't want to overwhelm everybody, but I don't want to bore you either. So let me know. So for now, sláinte.